I'm a curmudgeon normally, so then throw in coronavirus, that's just not a good mix.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Plain Truth, a Holy Spirited podcast. I'm Maggie Elmer, and I am here with
David Watson,
Scott Kisker,
and our special guest, Reverend Keith Boyette. Thank you so much for being with us, Keith.
My joy.
Awesome. Well, we're here to talk about a lot of things, but before we get started, why don't you go ahead and just tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and how we might all know you.
Sure. Well, I'm currently the president of the Wesleyan Covenant Association, but earlier in my life, I am a trial attorney, having practiced law in Richmond, Virginia for 13 years as a civil litigator and appellate advocate. In 1991, God called me out of the practice of law into the ordained ministry. I went to Asbury Theological Seminary for 3 years, where I got my Master of Divinity, and returned to Virginia, where I was ultimately ordained an elder and pastored a rural church for 4 years, 150-year-old congregation. And then in 1998, I was called and appointed by the bishop to start a new church, which became Wilderness Community Church, located in the wilderness area of Spotsylvania County, where the Battle of the Wilderness was fought in the Civil War. And I was pastor of Wilderness Community Church from 1998 until 2017, when I became president of the Wesleyan Covenant Association, which is my full-time job at this point. During that time when I was at Wilderness for 8 years, from 2000 to 2008, I was a member of the Judicial Council of the United Methodist Church, which is our denomination's Supreme Court.
Wow.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it is.
I've told that story a few times.
Well, you have it down. Really well done.
Yeah.
I bet serving on the Judicial Council is lots of fun.
Well, it was during a very interesting time in the church's life. As you all know, for 48 years of our 52-year life as a denomination, we've had conflict around issues of human sexuality. And during that 8-year period, the conflict had moved from general conference to being battled out in the judiciary of the church. There were a number of challenges to the church's disciplinary provisions before the Judicial Council. And the council decided each of those decisions in favor of upholding the church's position, which then led to what we've been experiencing, the resistance and disobedience, ecclesial disobedience movement. So that was an important chapter in our denomination's journey toward this. I would tell you that most people do not get real excited by what the Judicial Council does in the normal course of things. It's pretty dry stuff.
Yeah, sure.
But we're certainly grateful for it. So a lot has been going on lately in our denomination, as you have alluded to.
And in the world.
In the world, yes. Here we are. We're recording this podcast via Zoom because it is April 9th, and we're all staying home per our governments and ecclesial leaders and governors' requests to stop the spread of this coronavirus. And because of this pandemic, our global meeting, the General Conference of the United Methodist Church, has been postponed a whole year. And we had some pretty big things on the table for discussion.
Like the division of the denomination being one of them.
Yeah. I'm sensing that I'm understating things.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're really excelling in that regard today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm just trying to provide some objectivity. Things are hysterical enough as it is.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Are we basically a month out from when it was supposed to be? I mean,
Sure. We were supposed to meet from May the 5th through the 15th.
so
Yeah.
not
we
even a
would have
month,
been
a couple
done
weeks.
a month from now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
So-
We're in the midst of it.
So just like the called special conference, there were several plans on the table.
Correct.
And one of the plans that was on the table for this meeting that is not being voted on because there's not a meeting happening was the protocol plan.
Correct.
So can you give us a little overview of what the sort of the bullet points of that are?
Well, I would say first, part of what makes the protocol so unique is it is the first plan for an amicable separation of the United Methodist Church that has been supported by and people from every perspective have been involved in its preparation at the highest leadership levels of those different constituencies in our church. So you had members of the Council of Bishops, including the president and the president-elect of the Council of Bishops. You had leaders of the progressive and centrist and traditionalist advocacy groups. Never before have we had that kind of comprehensive plan. And basically what it provided for and provides for is the possibility of the denomination amicably separating, with a portion of the denomination continuing as what would be the post-separation United Methodist Church, and then the likely creation of a traditionalist Methodist Church and potentially a liberationist Methodist Church, which would be the most progressive part of the United Methodist Church, as separate denominations. And conferences, central conferences, which are the international parts of our church, annual conferences, both inside the United States and outside the United States, and local churches would have had the ability to take votes to align with one of those denominational expressions that would emerge. And in addition, it addressed for the first time some of the financial considerations of the separation of the church as well. Other plans had sought to do the alignment question, but this is the first plan that had also reached a proposal on the financial aspects of the separation.
So the major difference between this and the Indianapolis plan, because both are separation proposals, right? But this got a lot more into the weeds regarding finances and regarding the specifics of separation, right?
Well, it got much more into the weeds on finances. The format for separation is similar, but the voting percentages are different in the protocol from the Indianapolis plan.
Yeah, there's the 57% vote, right? Would you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the major difference between traditionalists and centrist and progressives around separation and alignment is whether the vote should be at a 50% simple majority basis, or whether it should be a 2/3 vote, a supermajority vote, with the progressives and centrists insisting on a 2/3 vote and the traditionalists arguing for a simple majority. The compromise and the protocol was the result of a mediation, and every aspect of it is a compromise. Nobody got what they were looking for in the agreement. The compromise in the protocol is that for an annual conference to make an alignment decision, different than staying in the United Methodist Church, the vote that has to be achieved is 57%, which has no rational basis. It was simply a down and dirty compromise. It's essentially 50% between a 2/3 vote and a 50% vote. At the local church level, The compromise was that the leadership body of that local church, its administrative council, leadership board, whatever they call it, will make a decision whether the alignment vote by the local church will be 50% or 2/3. And there are various considerations a local church might use.
But is there a different formula in place at the moment for the central conferences?
Central conferences are to, in order for an entire central conference to separate from the United Methodist Church and join a new Methodist denomination, they'll have to get a 2/3 vote. So the compromise there was the international bishops that were part of the negotiations wanted a 2/3 vote at every level for the central conference, for the annual conference, and for the local church. We were able to compromise by letting it still be 2/3 at the central conference level, but an annual conference in the central conferences has the same vote as an annual conference in the United States, 57%.
So, Keith, what happens if we get to the general conference, which now is not going to happen in May, but it'll happen sometime next year? What happens if we get there and the protocol doesn't pass?
Right. Well, so the signatories of the protocol agreed that they would support the adoption of the protocol, but each of the signatories has been instrumental in proposing and developing other plans, all of which are prevailing before the general conference as well. So if the protocol didn't pass, those of us who were instrumental in developing the Indianapolis plan would likely continue to push the Indianapolis plan. Those who were involved in developing the next generation plan, Next plan would likely push that. So it could be that the General Conference could turn to one of those plans. And of course, as you're probably aware, a group called Forward has proposed the new plan, the New Expressions of Methodism, which in classic Methodist tradition proposes that we establish another commission to work toward amicable separation.
Liaison.
Yeah, so historically, they're probably the truest plan to what we've always done as a denomination,
Right.
but most fraught with the likelihood of no success.
Yeah.
And of course, the denomination, the delegates to a future general conference that will be held could decide that, you know what, they don't want to address a separation of the denomination and attempt to either change what the discipline says on this or continue the disciplinary position. But I would very quickly say any number of people carefully evaluate the distribution of delegates that are elected. We know who those delegates are from every annual conference. We have very good intelligence on how those delegates evaluate the issues that are before us. And I can tell you that probably unlike any other general conference, this is a deeply divided general conference on the underlying issues. And so it's unlikely anybody would get a majority to establish, or much of a majority to establish a position. So we are truly deadlocked in an irreconcilable place.
I'm glad you said that, because as you were going over the percentages, the question I had in my mind is, what is the likelihood of a strong majority in one particular direction? If we sort of say that there are three sort of broad groups, it sort of seems like a majority isn't exactly possible.
Well, that's why each of the plans that have been proposed seek to accomplish separation without requiring a constitutional amendment. Yeah. Because a constitutional amendment would require a 2/3 vote of the delegates plus a 2/3 vote of all the annual conference delegates around the world. And I can tell you I'm not even sure if we were voting on whether we ought to continue to claim John Wesley as our ancestor in Methodism, whether we'd get a 2/3 vote to support that. But I'm being facetious. Hopefully we would agree on that.
I'm not sure about that. I'm
I don't know.
Wow.
Sure. But Maggie, to your point, there are differences in our annual conferences. So, for example, there are some annual conferences that are clearly overwhelmingly traditional in their outlook.
Right.
And so under the protocol, there is some probability that in some of those annual conferences, they will vote by 57% to separate from the United Methodist Church. There probably is no annual conference that would vote by that large a margin to become completely liberationist. But clearly there are traditional, and clearly outside of the United States, in the Philippines, in Africa, where there are strong traditional perspectives, we could expect that there'll be votes there that would result in separation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
did we already cover, like, how did we come up with the number 57%?
Yeah, we did.
Covered.
We covered that.
Did that already?
Covered.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, Scott, did you remember the question?
Answer?
It was a compromise.
Oh, okay.
So nobody was happy.
In fact, on that 57% for annual conferences, which was a flat out compromise, it did split the difference between 2/3 and 50%. That was the very last term of the protocol agreed to. It was agreed to in the last 30 minutes that we had to meet. We had been arguing about that for 5 consecutive our previous days of mediation. We had argued about it throughout that 6th day. The mediator said, I have to leave at this time. If you have not reached agreement, we will mark this as unsuccessful. And so it was the mediator who said, you either walk away from this whole process without an agreement, or you adopt the recommendation I'm going to put before you, that you split the difference and agree to 57% on that. And even then, it was quite a process of persuading our constituencies that were not in the mediation room to permit us to all agree to that percentage. So,
yeah, that seemed, I didn't envy that job.
No, I would tell you it was not a lot of fun, although my background as a trial attorney and appellate advocate certainly fitted me. I've been in many settings like this, but the way I describe it, the atmosphere throughout the protocol negotiation was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. There was a high level of animosity in the room amongst all of the participants. Not personal animosity, but the rawness of St. Louis, that general conference, persisted, and it wasn't until we reached agreement finally that you felt the tension bleed out of the air. So.
Scott, did you remember the question you wanted to ask?
Well, it's probably, I don't know if you want to, I mean, I was just noting that I think this is the only one of the plans that had international contribution to it, as well as, different ideological perspectives, but that there were folks, from central conferences and, Africa and I don't know if Asia, some other places besides, the U.S.
Well, that is true. The Indianapolis plan that I was instrumental in before the protocol was completely U.S. based people. The Next Generation plan was completely U.S. based. And the new plan from Ford is also a completely U.S. based plan. The protocol came about as the result of Central Conference bishops inviting us to come to the table and begin the conversation. And there were international bishops, Central Conference bishops, mainly Bishop Yambasu from Sierra Leone, Bishop Alstead from the Nordic part of Europe, and Bishop Juan from the Philippines that were involved. The unfortunate thing in this is that the rank and file from the central conferences were not represented at the table. There were not non-Episcopal participants from outside the United States.
That would change things to a certain extent, wouldn't it, to have non-Episcopal
Absolutely.
folks there from outside the United States? Yeah.
Not all bishops would this be true of, but all of us are to some extent motivated by self-interest, of course. And certainly...
that's the epistemic consequence of sin.
Yes. Yeah. You're right.
I was going to say that.
I knew you were, and I just thought I'd hand it to you.
Yeah.
We can't go through a podcast without that being mentioned. So,
while we could say that we're trying to be selfless in decisions that we make and all, undoubtedly every one of us are impacted by a level of self-interest. So clearly, bishops have a certain agenda. By the way, they presumably, they've taken a vow as part of being consecrated as bishops to work for the unity of the church. And so, of course, that's a real difficulty here. You're talking about amicable separation of the church, and yet they're pledged to unity. And then when you try to talk about unity, what do you mean by unity? For us in the United Methodist Church, unity has become holding the institution together, not unity around a core set of doctrines and ethical positions. And I think that's been part of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. We're not working from a common definition of what unity means.
Right.
There's a lot of talk about it, but we're kind of talking past each other.
Right.
Yeah. It's a choir that's not singing from the same song sheet. So it's
precisely
just cacophony.
Or the same song.
All right. Good job on the metaphors, you guys.
Meanwhile, the ship is sinking.
Yeah. Right. So add a new metaphor.
We're not just rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic. We're singing a song as it sinks as well. So.
Yeah, I think that actually happened.
I believe so. Yeah,
it did. Yeah. All right. Well, so presumably at some point on the other side of the good Lord knows when, there will be a vote and there will be a consequence to that vote. And so we've sort of discussed what could happen if...
Do we know when General Conference is going to be? The new one?
Is it 2021?
Yeah.
Well, it has not been officially announced. There's been all kinds of rumors out there.
I must be listening to rumors.
Yeah.
Wars and rumors of wars.
And that's appropriate.
That's not a metaphor. Yeah.
But I would say the common consensus is it's likely to be late summer of 2021 or into the early fall of 2021, which unfortunately is 15 months after it was originally scheduled.
Yeah. So we've discussed what could happen if the protocol didn't pass. We've discussed a few options, other plans that could come. But what does Methodism look like if it does pass? So on the other side of this, we, as far as the expression of Methodism that you could speak into, what are you hoping for?
Well, of course, that's been the primary Well, one of the three aspects of the primary mission of the Wesleyan Covenant Association was to prepare for the possibility that a separation might occur and that there might be the birth of a new traditional Methodist expression. Our hope was not that that would ultimately occur, because we wanted to keep the United Methodist Church faithful and see a renewal and revival of the United Methodist Church. But everyone agrees that separation is about the only way we're going to move forward off of this. And so the Wesleyan Covenant Association has worked very hard to envision a new traditional Methodist church. And even since the protocol has come out, we've worked beyond the confines of the WCA to engage other Methodists that are traditionally minded in this process. So you may be aware that in early March, right before the COVID-19 shutdown, a group of Methodists gathered in Atlanta, Georgia, to see if we could come up with a common vision that would result in a single new traditional Methodist church emerging. And the Holy Spirit moved in a powerful way during that 3-day meeting. And we emerged with unity amongst that group. And we released a statement that is entitled Reimagining the Passion of a Global Wesleyan Movement. It's accessible on the WCA website. You can read it. But at the core, we envision a recapturing of a truly global church. Not a church. Right now, you could say the United Methodist Church is global, but it's really a fragmented global church. And the vision that the centrists and progressives have for the United Methodist Church is a balkanized United Methodist Church. It is a regionalized United Methodist Church that has different doctrines in some ways and different ethical teachings in different parts of the world, contextualized regionally. We envision a truly global United Methodist Church that holds to one faith, one ethical approach to the Christian faith. We envision a church that is much more focused on its core mission, which is introducing people to Jesus, helping them become his fully devoted disciples, empowering them and preparing them to be makers of disciples. We believe that the world is impacted by persons who come to faith in Jesus Christ, who then grow and become more like Jesus in character, and that's the way God's kingdom comes and enters into our time and space. So we're committed to those classic disciplines of Methodism. The meeting in small groups, what Wesley would have referred to as class meetings and bands, holding one another accountable to the faith in love, investing in those spiritual disciplines that are necessary as means of grace for us to grow and mature as disciples, being evangelistically oriented to bring Christ into persons' lives and communities that are far from God, planting new faith communities, new churches in places where there's not a witness to the Orthodox Christian faith. Here in the United States and globally, spirit-filled worship, global missional partnerships. The United Methodist Church, at one time Methodism was, and it still is cited as one of the primary examples of a movement. But United Methodism has become an institution. And United Methodism is marked by a huge bureaucratic structure which consumes a significant amount of resources just to prop up, let alone do any ministry. And so we envision a much more nimble, leaner denominational structure where the primary focus is on the local church, its ministries, and the church, the denomination purpose is to support and empower that local church's efforts, not the local church existing to prop up and fund a denominational structure.
Mm-hmm.
I could go on and on and
on.
But
what novel ideas.
I'm not sure they're so novel.
I know, they sound a lot like
the
early church. Okay.
Well, and Keith, I think one of the misconceptions is that the WCA is going to be a church. And the WCA is not going to be a church. The WCA has simply laid some groundwork for a new traditionalist denomination. Is that accurate?
Sure. We may be one of the few organizations in the world that was formed with a sunset provision envisioned, that there would come a day when we would cease to exist. Mm. And as president of the WCA, I am committed to that. People ask, what am I going to do in the new denomination? And I say, I'm going to take a very long vacation. I don't aspire to a particular role. I'm not trying to create something for myself. But certainly, David, I would say there was the possibility at a time in the life of the WCA where the WCA could have morphed into the new denomination. We certainly are set up so that we have regional chapters, and part of the vision of that was that if we had to become a denomination, we could. But I say that would be a denomination formed basically in battle that was forced to. But with this possibility of an amicable separation, the role I just used, the words I used to describe the role of the WCA is that we are now midwives. We are a midwife for the launching of a new Methodist denomination, and so we're hoping, and we're seeding, we're sowing seeds. The Global Legislative Assembly of the WCA, authorized in 2018 a Next Steps working group, which prepared a draft book of doctrines and discipline for a new denomination. That's a proposal. I mean, sometimes people approach me as if that's already been decided, right. But it is a proposal that will ultimately be presented to a convening conference. Yeah. So everything we're doing is to help empower a movement to be born, and ultimately we will have a convening conference for this new traditional denomination when it comes into existence.
And that has been delayed now, right? I mean, that will be after the general conference.
That's correct, because there's no way. One of the most important aspects of the protocol, and I'm not sure people really realize the significance of this. The protocol says that local churches that separate from the United Methodist Church to join a new denomination do so taking their property with them free from the trust clause. That has never happened in the history of denominations in the United States, or for that matter, worldwide. So if churches were try to leave before general conference, they are subject to that trust clause. The denomination has and would enforce that trust clause. There would be the kind of litigation that the Episcopalians, for example, have experienced, spending over $80 million on lawyers. By the way, I'm all for the full employment of lawyers. Just don't use God's money for it, okay? But I mean, we don't want to be in a situation where that kind of conflict is what produces a new denomination, unless we have no alternative at all. So you're exactly right. The launch of this new denomination would occur after the adoption of the protocol. But we are working overtime right now. And we Scott referred to this a little bit earlier. God is using this time. He's not wasting this crisis, this global pandemic. He's at work in the midst of it, not only in people's lives, as he's teaching all of us new things of how we relate to each other in these kinds of environments, but he's using this time in what we're doing to help us be even better prepared for the launch of that new denomination.
How will that come about in terms of, like, I know there'll be the general conference, and then will there be annual conferences shortly after that? I mean, I know when it was happening in May, of course, we were all planning on annual conferences in June-ish, and then
Right.
I don't.
Yeah. Here. I mean, of course, I'm tracking this. About I think maybe about 15 annual conferences have already announced postponements of their 2020 annual conferences. So the COVID-19 situation is already impacting the occurrence of annual conferences this year. All of the jurisdictional conferences have been postponed. They'll be scheduled at some point after the rescheduled general conference. So presumably, I mean, let's just assume hypothetically that the general conference now occurs in August of 2021. There's a possibility that special annual conferences could be called thereafter. The jurisdictional conferences likely will be scheduled after that general conference.
If the protocol passes, what would a jurisdictional conference do?
Well, because the United Methodist Church continues, the jurisdictional conference would meet to fulfill the purposes of a jurisdictional conference under the Constitution,
Which
to
is
elect
to elect
bishops and that sort of thing. Now, the problem is that they won't know how many annual conferences they will be in the post-separation UMC. They won't necessarily know how many bishops they will need. I mean, this is the perfect storm for the United Methodist Church right now.
I mean, assuming that if the protocol were to pass, my guess is that there will be more bishops for a continuing, more progressive United Methodist Church than there are annual conferences to be overseen by those bishops. I mean, I can't imagine the jurisdictional conferences are going to have a lot of work until after the annual conferences have their vote to figure out where is this all going to settle. You know what I mean?
Quite possibly. I mean, you're exactly right. They could have more bishops than annual conferences to assign them to. No one really knows what percentage of churches will choose to separate and join a new denomination. But, GCFA, even the General Council on Finance and Administration, even without the protocol having been adopted and its implications, was already recommending a 1/3 reduction in the next quadrennial budget. And they were signaling that if the protocol passed and as much as 20 to 30% of the churches departed from the United Methodist Church just in the US, that it was going to be an even steeper decline in the next quadrennial budget. So, and I mean, I'm not a prophet, and so I don't know what the impact of COVID-19 will be, but already that local churches are being adversely affected financially. I would fully expect that they're going to take care of their core ministries before they look beyond themselves, which means that apportionments that flow upstream to the denomination are going to be significantly reduced, which is just going to further exacerbate the perfect storm that the United Methodist Church is facing. And I don't rejoice in any of this. I mean, the reality is that our church not only has been in decline in terms of making disciples and in effective ministry globally, but we're now hemorrhaging financially, and we've been hemorrhaging worship attendance and that sort of thing for years. So the sooner we get to the other side of this,
right, which is why waiting this one more delay seems so painful.
There's sunshine on the other side of this storm, and that sunshine is the sooner we get there, and we can have people aligned theologically around mission, the more effective. I mean, it's phenomenal. You go to an annual conference meeting in the United Methodist Church, and there is no joy. There is conflict and stress and tension. Nobody really wants to be at those meetings, but you're required to be there, and so you are.
I have to admit, I was semi-hopeful after St. Louis and then my annual conference that happened, shortly thereafter, that would be the last time I would ever have to go, that this summer we would have already divided into 2 different annual conferences.
Right.
And I would not have, because it was pure awfulness.
It was, yeah. But then you contrast. You go to a gathering of the Wesleyan Covenant Association where everybody is theologically aligned. Everybody has a common vision for the future. There is great joy and rejoicing. There's an experience of the presence of the Holy Spirit. Now, I want to tell you, when you talk to Darren Cushman Wood, talk to him about gatherings of those who are progressively minded. They experience that same thing in terms of alignment and joy around a common commitment to a mission. We have to get this battle out of the way so that we will all be outwardly focused. We've got all our energies focused inwardly in this time, which is why we're dying.
Right. All our energy is about fighting each other for our vision of mission instead of actually figuring out how to do the mission.
Right. I mean, Jesus said, if you seek to save your life, you will lose it. And so the United Methodist Church is fighting to, quote, save its life, however the different groups define it, and it's rapidly losing its life. Jesus said, if you will lose your life for my sake, you'll find life, you'll have life. And that's what I think the future holds for us as we are able to join together in common commitment to what we believe and what we practice as followers of Jesus Christ.
Well, I'm glad that we were able to end there.
Can we sing Kumbaya?
You had me worried for a second. But, well, I think, I think certainly we all want everyone to experience what you're talking about, the joy of common commitment, coming together, united around shared beliefs, ideologies, and even doctrines that reflect those things. So, we are certainly grateful that there are people in the church on all sides who are able to diagnose the reality of the situation that we're in and then get to the hard work of just, the nitty-gritty of piecing out how do we fix this and get to a different place from where we are now. So we're very grateful for people like you, Keith. And we're really grateful that you took time to be with us on the podcast today.
It's a great joy for me, and you all are delightful to spend time with.
Thank you.
We know that you're talking about me. That's
we actually have no doubt about that at all, really.
Right.
You're the rose between 2 thorns.
No doubt. No doubt.
You guys, this has been our podcast for today. Thank you so much to Reverend Keith Boyette, the president of the WCA. And as he says, hopefully soon to just be enjoying church and not, presidential
physical distancing.
Yeah.
None of this.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And thank you to the listeners. We know that you guys have a lot of things on your plate right now. And when you take your time to listen to us in the midst of all this, we're really grateful for that. Check us out on Twitter at Holy Spirit Pod. Check out Spirit and Truth, the ministry with which we are associated. Spirit and Truth. I'm getting all of the handles mixed up right now.
At Spirit Truth Life.
Thank you. At Spirit Truth Life. It's been a minute since I've done this. Give us a follow on Facebook, rate and like the podcast so other people can find it. And you guys, thank you so much for being with us, and we will come back to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.